Hi everybody. So today we're going to be looking at really the creation of the Constitution and some of the major issues that arose during the Constitutional Convention. So we'll be looking at that today and tomorrow. So yesterday you guys should have looked at what were the Articles of Confederation. And really the major issues that arose during that period of time where our government was run under those Articles of Confederation. You might remember that it made a weak national government, and really the national government was at the mercy of the states. Okay, and we saw that play out during Shays' Rebellion, where those discontented farmers rose up and really created an army that the state militias could not deal with. And so after Shays' Rebellion, many Americans were ready to see a strong national government. Okay, and so in 1787, a few months after Shays' Rebellion, delegates from the states began meeting to propose changes to the Articles of Confederation. And Congress gave its consent. They were like, you know what? Yep, let's get together. Let's revise the articles. But after months of debate, they abandoned that idea. And they said, you know what? Instead of revising the articles, let's just completely restart and create an entirely new government with a new guiding document. And that would become the Constitution. Okay, so before we look at the major issues that arose during that creation of the Constitution, let's talk about some of the things that all of the delegates at this convention could agree upon. Okay, so the first thing is they all favored the ideas of limited government and representative government. Okay, they decided, you know what, we're going to have a limited government. That way that government cannot infringe on our rights. But we also need to separate that government into different parts, okay? And we should all know these different parts. We're going to have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, okay? And then, on top of that, we all agree that we need to have a stronger national government, all right? Now, those three things are great in theory, okay? We're going to have a limited government. We're going to separate that government into three parts, and at the same time, we're going to create a stronger national government. All right, no one had a question on that. What people did question is, how are we going to put these ideas into practice? All right, how much should we limit the national government? What should the separation of powers look like? And how are we going to do all that, but at the same time, create a stronger national government? Alright, so let's look at the problems that arose basically right away. Okay, and they all have to do with the idea of representation. How are we going to make sure that in our government the people are represented, maybe not equally, but fairly? Okay, and the first plan that arose was known as the Virginia Plan. Okay, so the plan proposed a government based on three principles. All right, now the first thing is that the government's going to have a strong national legislator, okay, with two different chambers. All right, now the lower chamber is to be chosen by the people, and the upper chamber to be chosen by the lower chamber. All right, now the number of legislatures that each state gets would vary from state to state, and it would simply be determined by how many people lived in the state. So if you were a state like Virginia, you are obviously going to have more representation in your government. Now that sounds great, right? That makes sense. However, the smaller states were not necessarily on board with that. Okay, and they said, you know what, that's not fair. Because eventually the national government's just going to be run by the states that have the most people. Okay, so one of those small states in particular was known as New Jersey. All right, so the New Jersey Plan. Okay, so the delegates for the small states, they made a counter proposal, and the New Jersey Plan said, we don't think that it's necessarily fair to give representation based on population. Instead, we think that each state should get the same number of representatives. Now, if you're a big state like Virginia, you're sitting back and being like, nope, don't like that. Okay? And as the summer wore on, the convention became deadlocked over the question of representation of states in Congress. And you have to understand the debates were very, very bitter, and the convention was actually in danger of dissolving because we could not decide how should we have the people represented in Congress. Okay, but finally, we're going to have a special committee that designed a compromise, and it's known as the Connecticut Compromise, or better yet, the Great Compromise. Okay, and this plan is going to be adopted, and the compromise suggested that we are going to make a legislative branch that is bicameral. That just simply means that there are two different houses in our legislative branch. Okay, so the first house is going to be known as the House of Representatives, and it's going to be based on the number of representatives. It's going to be based on each state's population. So if you're a big state like Virginia, you're like, yeah, okay. But the other house, which will become known as the Senate, your state, regardless of population, you get 2 representatives. So again, if you are a smaller state like New Jersey, you're like, yeah, okay. And it's going to work out in the end. That is what we still use today. Okay. Now, the last major thing that's going to arise is the profound disagreement about how to count enslaved people. Obviously in matters of representation, but then also taxation. Okay. Now, almost 1/3 of the people living in the southern states were enslaved African Americans. So if you are a southern state like Virginia and a lot of your population is slaves, you're like, okay, we need power in Congress, so we want to count our slaves for representation and taxation. And the northern states are like, no, we don't want enslaved people counted for tax purposes or for representation. And so what we're going to do, we're going to have another compromise, and it's known as the 3/5 compromise. Okay, and it's going to settle the deadlock. So instead of counting all of the enslaved people, instead, only 3/5 are going to be counted for both tax purposes and for representation. Okay, and up until 1868, enslaved people were counted in this manner. All right, and if you actually go and look in the Constitution, it does not say enslaved people, but it says something else, and we're actually going to look at that today. Alright guys, so today we looked at the Constitutional Convention at the very beginnings, the things that all of the delegates agreed upon, but then also the major problems that arose in terms of dealing with the issues of how are we going to represent people in Congress. If you guys have any questions, comments, or concerns, you can obviously leave that here on the YouTube page. You can leave a comment in Google Classroom, or better yet, you can send me a personal email, and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Alright guys, until next time, I'll see you later.